Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Just to be with the Zoom people, but happy to have you here. And let's begin, because today we have a full day, and hopefully along the way more attendees will come with the one we have already on Zoom. So, good morning, everyone. And welcome to this conference titled From the Margin and Outside the Box, Researching New Perspective on Researching the Military. My name is Johanna Massé, and for the opening remark, I will do something that I ask today's presenter not to do, which is I will switch from French to English, just to show you what you don't do. And so people on the Zoom and here, if you want, can see if the translation device works. But yes, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the CIDP, the Center for International and Defense Policy. And I am also the proud organizer of this conference, who was joined, thank you, who was born from a joint initiative from the CIDP and the Canadian Defense and Security Network, the CDSN. And it was made possible because of a targeted engagement grant from the MINDS program. So before we begin, I would like to thank this partner. Without them, it could not have been possible. But yes, today's conference would not have been possible without the help and support from a lot of people. And I am amazed by all this support, because at the very beginning, the idea behind this project came from me sometimes feeling frustrated because I felt like I didn't fit exactly what the military study in my mind should look like. I was a bit too interpretative. I was a bit too inductive. My level of analysis was micro. My position was a bit too reflexive. And even when it comes to my research interest, I came to be interested into, thank you. I come to be interested into women integration after working on women engagement during political conflict. And if there was interconnection between the two subjects, I was still very much unfamiliar with working on studying the military institution. And let's say it was a learning curve for me. But I discovered along the way that and I'm getting lost, but that the field was much more asserted than most people usually think of when they think of the word military. And at the time when the military itself is questioning its place and future in a changing world, there is a lot of new, really interesting research being done. And it may not be exactly what we think of when we think of the military, but there is much to learn from these different perspectives and approaches. And that is the reason behind this conference. It's to provide a venue for researchers and research a bit outside the box. The
idea was to organize an event celebrating diversity and inclusiveness, and this on several levels. First of all, on the level of language. That's when you're testing your translation devices. This event was conceived as entirely bilingual, bringing together both French and English-speaking researchers, because language should never be a barrier to the acquisition of knowledge. The event is simultaneously translated thanks to the work of our interpreters, without whom this whole conference would not have been possible. It is therefore necessary to recognize the importance of their role. This event was also intended as a way to learn beyond Canadian borders. And we are fortunate to have on our agenda today researchers from France, the Netherlands, Germany, the United States, and India, some of whom have traveled to Kingston to be with us today. And it is also about learning across disciplinary boundaries. And among the presentations we will hear today, we will be treated to works of sociological, anthropological, ethnographic, historical, and even legal inspiration. Some of these presentations will be made by established researchers and some by researchers who are just beginning their careers, some from the academic world and others from the defense world. The idea behind this event is to encourage a dialogue and an exchange that is not always present, or at least not as much as it should be, between the world of defense and the academic world, but also between generations of researchers. Finally, the idea was also to achieve gender parity as the defense community, like the defense research community, is not recognized to be diverse. On this point, we clearly exceeded our expectations with a majority of female researchers with us today, but it's not like we're going to complain about that.
As you may have seen in our program, which is available outside and also online if you want. But between 5 panels, 1 book presentation, and 1 final keynote, I can safely say that there will be something for everyone. And each presentation is about 50 minutes long with then a Q&A section after that. And because the day is full, I will be strict on time management. So yes, but I'm sure that even if you want to ask some question from the attendee here or the one online, and we don't have time during the Q&A section, please don't hesitate to go see the presenter and ask them your question, or even write for the one who are virtual. But yes, our first panel is titled Participatory Research Within the Military Institution, from Observation to Action Research in the Service of the Service Member. And it will be half virtual, half in presence, and half French and half English. After a break, where there will be things to eat outside, we will meet again for the second panel, this time titled Live Experiences Under Scrutiny, Learning from the Service Member Themselves. It will be a short panel, but I mean, very related to the first one, but it will be very interesting. And the last panel of the morning is named Representation of Gendered and Sexual Identities Toward a More Inclusive and Diverse Military Institution. And it will be fully English, but half virtual and half in presence. Then we have the most important part of the day, the lunch. And then we meet again with the book presentation of Professor Grazia Scopio and Sarah Greco being virtual. But they will present their new book, which is called The Power of Diversity in the Armed Force, International Perspective on Immigrant Participation in the Military. And besides being a very interesting topic, it may give you good idea for Christmas gift, just saying. But we will move to the fourth panel, which is about culture change and the difficulty of capturing the military institutional evolution, which once again will be partly virtual and in presence, partly French and partly English. And the last panel of the day is after break, there's break. Short break, but there's break. And the last panel of the day is titled State Power and Military Force, a Complex and Changing Relationship. But it's not the end of the day, because after the last panel, we have the final keynote, which will be done by Maria Ross-Reblay, And it will be indirect from Australia, but it will be perfect to end this day because her presentation is about a research she's doing, and it's about the state of diversity in Canadian security studies. But yes, it will be a long day, and I've spoken now for too long, but last thing, before we begin, I want to say that we are very grateful to be able to organize this event and on this land, which is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We wish, I'm sorry, I should have get some water. But we wish to acknowledge this territory's significance for the indigenous people who lived and continue to live on upon it, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to this land and continue to develop in relation to this territory and its other inhabitants today. But let's begin, and I hope you will have fun. So, first panel.
Hello to everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for this organization, which must have been quite major. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll begin right away. My name is Marguerite. I'm beginning my third year in integrating women into the military, more specifically in the French Army. And I've called on a number of different methodologies, more specifically interviews and more or less participant observation. You'll understand why soon enough. And that's the one that I'd like to speak about today. For this paper, I will first present my fieldwork and my thoughts on the way I had access to the data that I will present after that. And I'd like to propose a means of interpreting this data. Regarding my fieldwork, I spent between 3 weeks and a month in 3 different Army training centers. The first one was a combat training and evaluation center for infantry companies or squadrons for the cavalry. The second was a training and hardening center in a dangerous environment. And the third was also similar, but not in a dangerous area, but a commando force. Each one of these sessions was very different. And the first was on the field. I basically spent my time with instructors. I was also able to spend time with the trainees, doing some of the activities with them, as well with the instructors and monitors. And that was less participatory because I was working with them. So one thing should be said about these centers. They were mainly populated by men from arms or units called combat cadet infantry, cavalry, to a lesser extent, and sometimes combat engineers as well. And now you might be thinking, well, why is she going to observe the integration of women in places where there are none or perhaps very few? And this is where I'd like to first point to a first limitation to the advantages of the more or less participant observation method aimed at studying women for themselves on their own behalves. If you haven't chosen the combat unit, which happens to be an exception statistically, because in France, combat units are among the least feminized units in the French army, one is quickly faced with a dilemma. Either one studies combat and finds no or very few women, or one studies women and loses the combat dimension. And when you're looking to look at the relations between women and combat, that would be our first research outcome. And I might be exaggerating a bit because there are always exceptions. But we don't have a lot of time to get into these details. But to remedy this problem, I was last in the training center through which all of the non-commissioned officers of the Army passed and still move through. That is almost all of the officers of the army moved through this. So I found far more women there than elsewhere, but these were not necessarily women destined for combat arms. And there's a second limitation that I do believe is worth mentioning with respect to this observation methodology. Even if you do have women in these units, the last one that I looked at, I didn't have access to them as I had access to the men. And I think that's because they're a minority as well. That's where the interview was a good additional method, because with women in the army, during these training sessions, which they've almost all experienced, they expressed and were able to reveal themselves to the study. And these became very compelling moments because they have to prove that they're able to integrate in order to be able to describe as peers. And most of them, in fact, adopt what I've called strategies of indifferentiation, that is to go unnoticed in terms of to become one of the guys. And in this context, talking to the doctoral student who works on women can be incompatible with these ambitions of going unnoticed. In addition, as soon as somebody from the outside comes in, there's often overexposure because suddenly they represent diversity. So if you like, there really is a sense of overexposure, and that also can have negative consequences of indifferentiation strategies and integration into the group. But these methodological difficulties led me for a long time to work more on men and their conceptions of women's integration into the military, rather than on the women themselves or their interactions with men. Now that I've addressed this, I'd like to tell you about some of the surprises I found in the field. The first is that I was very surprised to find that these fields, these training sessions, proved to be relatively conducive to many small informal conversations, which I found sometimes to be very intimate, insofar as they touched on, and maybe that's something that I personally experienced, but sometimes they touch on regrets, because men express some regrets about their families, the difficulties they experience following external operations or in their personal life, the difficulty in combining the army and their emotional lives. And there were also some criticisms of the institution, which sometimes were very frank, although, and that's why this is so interesting, what we'll be seeing in a bit, because in fact, I was being suspected. I was very suspicious because I was often called to the agent who had infiltrated. I felt like I was a very clandestine character. I was called the Eye of Moscow. I was called a spy, or Marina Loiseau, who's a character in a series of undercover agents in the French Secret Service, because I realized that I seem to have extended my time by 2 minutes. I can't say everything. Basically, I'm a woman. I work on women. I'm a Parisian, and I've studied sociology, which often puts me on the left. And yet, I was all the more surprised when persons came to confide in me. In fact, I wondered about the factors that led to these so-called confessions. Maybe that's too strong a word to use. But I think it's due to this differentiation context. I've identified two main factors. The first is that these internships or trainings are often an opportunity where one waits for a great deal of time and in multiple forms. And this really struck me because when I had intimate conversations, we realized that we had this in common. For example, let's say I was with instructors and they were waiting for the interns to come to bring trainees to the house. We were sitting there and it was cold, and in the evening, or I would be sitting down with a beam with an instructor who had to check that trainees were respecting safety instructions and were waiting for orders to come down, and we would simply sit there, and it was a very compelling moment. Or, for example, when you're waiting for orders as well, before we know what is going to take place later. And the time when I had the most conversations is when we were in a vehicle. There were only two of us, and these are very important moments. And on the side of the trainees, often there are a lot of walks. They have to walk often. And when we walk with them, it's easier to step aside from the group a little bit and to spend time with them to discuss. So that was the first facilitating factor. The second one is that on the ground, except for the first one where I spent more time with instructors, but these were moments where trainees and instructors are forced to stay during the weekends and evenings on site. In fact, I stayed on the base. I was invited to their parties, to the meals that we made. We did activities on the weekends. We had beer. We went off to eat. Sometimes we went to dance. And the soldiers often described these moments in an interview as being moments of cohesion. And these are very important moments because they are isolated, they're removed from their emotional relationships. Often they don't have a phone, and they've been with the same people 24 hours a day, and they're experiencing things that are often difficult morally and physically. And it's a context where relations seem to be forged more quickly. And of course, the relationships are sped up. In fact, they told me that sometimes when they were talking with me, that was enabling them to create a bit of a bubble, a parenthesis, and that this was very welcome to them. And it reminded them of the world that they had left behind them during this internship. So that was my first surprise. My second surprise was to note that beyond the confidences I was given, there's a strong tendency to criticize developments that are seen as coming from the civil world and new generations. So here's a bit of a list. It's not complete, but there is the fact that young people are less athletic today because society has become more sedentary, which creates a kind of potato chip morale. And as well, there's less a sense of commitment by the younger generations who complain more about working conditions and their training. They don't want to do a career in the institutions as much. They spend less time with their colleagues and prefer to go home on weekends. As well, there's criticism regarding the increase in the use of sick leave as a means of protest or resistance, even for harassment. And there was also criticism of their pedagogical practices and their leaders. They criticized the new European directives on work hours, which makes it impossible for them to work on weekends and to be on the ground for several days and to obtain better training to be more combat ready. And as part of all this, there is, of course, there is the new army policy in favor of the proactive policy of the former Minister of the Armed Forces in favor of the integration of women, accused of accelerating the appointment of women to high command positions through practicing an unofficial quota policy. So following these points, I would like to express several remarks. So first of all, there's been a recontextualization in the course of daily interactions. The criticism of the more or less forced integration of women into the army is part of a set of other criticisms aimed at other developments that are also considered to come from the civilian world and that threaten both their working conditions as well as their professional morality. And through these criticisms, seems to me that the soldiers of the army, who are essentially from combat units, revealed what they consider to be the specificity of their profession, and that is that they were to be different, to follow different rules, and their professional ideals. That is, it is a profession or even a vocation that is exercised by someone who's athletic, seasoned, who puts his duty before everything else, whether it's money or family, and who's sufficiently trained to deal with the potential and real difficulties of an external operation or an actual war. As well, what they're asking for is also to be treated equally amongst themselves, that some do not use sick leave to bypass work or a transfer, or that women have an advantage because they're women. They thus reaffirm a form of meritocratic ideal and a fair sharing of the difficulties that the members experience in his profession. So, again, I've noted a number of new things that this pushes my thesis a bit further. First of all, it seems to me that this professional ideal is indeed more difficult to achieve for women with children, because the imperative availability is a problem. That said, it's also a problem regarding the integration of women in the army. However, if this problem is more prevalent for women, we also find that in a discourse of certain men. And secondly, oh my goodness, I've got 30 seconds left, is that most of these criticisms, which might appear reactionary, are to the extent that we're seeing another trend with military to demand more balance between their personal and professional lives, and we're seeing less of a disconnect with civilian society. So we could say that these tendencies to criticize the developments can be understood as reactions to a form of trivialization or civilization, even though it's a rather barbaric word being used by the actors, of their working conditions, which really calls into question what they consider to be at the very heart of their profession, this extra meaning or the extra soul, as some say, which is sought by many when they chose the profession. And in closing, first of all, I'd like to close on 2 points that are more general. Is that the military institution, which once considered by some scholars to be a total institution, again, I think what we're seeing now is that it's showing greater permeability to developments from the civilian world, and the integration of women in a historically male-dominated area is perhaps one of the most salient points. And it's clear that through participant observation and time spent with the actors in the workplaces is a means for us to understand a close relationship between issues of women's integration and changes in the military profession, and thus to include gender studies more intimately with military and labor sociology studies. And I'd like to close on that, and I apologize for having extended the time allotted to me by a little bit.
Est-ce que vous voulez que je prenne la suite de suite?
Oui.
Would you like me to continue? Yes, please go ahead.
Merci à vous.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful beginning. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Well, I would have lots of questions for you, but I'll try to stick to my 10 minutes as well. So thank you, Joanna, and thank you to the organizers for this conference, which is a tremendous opportunity, especially given that we have English-French interpretations. So first of all, I'd like to thank the interpreters who are allowing me to speak French and make it possible for everybody to hear us. I think French communication is a major issue, because when you speak English, you have the interpretation English, French, French, English, and they don't always use the same terms, and we always have to consider this. Some people are very competent to do this, and they're with us today, and so I'm very grateful to them. So I'd like to share my PowerPoint on screen. Can you please confirm that you can see this? Everybody can see the PowerPoint. Yesterday, I was able to post it on a big screen. That's wonderful. We can see well. So regarding today's presentation, even though I am a woman, I won't so much speak to genre, but rather how field works, military people work with anthropologists. And I joined an infantry company, and I thought about how I could adapt to the field. And I would like to turn the focal point on its head today. And that's what I'd like today, so that we can look at this from the other direction. for those of you who work in anthropology or connected social scientists, so you're able, why am I looking at this from another point of view? In anthropology, we look on shared lived experiences. We look at participatory studies. We're trying to understand other people's reality by making our own lived experience be secondary to that. So anthropology is done without initial assumptions. Anthropology always focuses on how the family works, how the society works within a given group, all the way knowing that we're not sure whether or not the group is what we're truly wanting to study. So as my director says, if you know what you're looking for, why are you looking for it in anthropology? And so given this logic, we come to the ground, we have a vague idea. I was wondering, I had a number of questions, and this was the question that I was asking then. That's the only means of studying anthropology which avoids us being completely blind in the field. So today, our actors on the ground are part of our study and the results. They had to have a voice that they could express because they're not anthropologists. They don't have the qualifications to do the actual study. That is, the study was made possible. We saw that in this presentation, Margaret. It's difficult to have access to the field, and I was able to access it. I was very lucky because I began by asking why we have French army doctors. And if we're speaking about a certain logic, our healthcare system is part of our society, of our cultures, why then do army doctors believe that they're citizens? Why are they so different? Why do they need a specific health system in the army? So then I thought, well, I'll go and look at the Army's instruction hospital, and then I would look at a parallel hospital, and then I would look at this more closely. It was difficult to access to this in anthropology, so I called on my neuroscience studies as well to address these specific barriers, which allowed me to work with the Army's Study Institute to be able to think through this and to find something that would enable me to look at this more closely. After 2 years of masters, we both realized that beyond the identity of military doctors, there's also the idea of representation of disease, because French soldiers cannot suffer from chronic illnesses. They are sent to other positions. So being ill is another reality. At the end of my master's, I realized that if it's different for a French soldier to be sick, is it different elsewhere as well? That's where my thesis came from. That's why I said, if you can look at French military doctors, can we not look at the soldiers to see what happens before and after when they have a disease? So from an anthropological point of view, suffering is an outlier. It's outside of the norm. So to access this reality of suffering, I wondered how one would go about measuring the daily life of the infantry or other groups that would be studied by me. So I realized that it was quite a sad reality that there are few research precedents in the field, but we find very few anthropological studies in the field, except when there is research that was conducted in anthropology with sociologists or psychologists, thanks to a multidisciplinary research team. And up until that time, until I found articles, I hadn't realized that these kinds of articles had been done by officers, and they have anthropological training. They're trained in human resources, etc., and they have a kind of insider knowledge. Either these were outside anthropologists that had semi-military issues. They wondered how civilians see soldiers and how soldiers are seen by civilians, and they're somewhere between those two worlds. but there are no outside anthropologists who are conducting an insider type of research. So I wondered about what suffering meant, and I wanted to see it from the insider point of view, where I didn't have research over 10 years of in the field. So looking at this on the ground was a possibility. And as you can see here, I had 5 main components in my research teams. They represented the 5 major issues and the persons that had to be involved for this research. Obviously, we had my research director who looked at the anthropological side. In fact, there are very few or no anthropologists could help me. You had to have somebody who was trained in psychology, etc. We also had research military doctors who supported me in my master's research. And we also needed these military doctor and researchers. They work on a kind of a scientific background for the Army that allowed me to render legitimacy to this. That is, that they validated my research methods. And there was the issue of funding in French universities. And basically, this means that the financing comes from the outside in light of work done and anthropological community work. Given what we were doing, it was difficult to obtain funding. So it is the Defense Innovation Agency that provided funding. It is very innovative. It's part of the French Army, which allows for innovation, both for the benefit of the Army, but it's also managed by it. So it is still military, but not entirely from the outside. So once I had obtained funding, then we needed an internal and outside research. And I turned to the Army Psychological Support and Intervention Unit because they're in touch with all of the regiments when it comes to potential suffering. And that's not only at a specific unit, but upstream as well. The idea is to get a general picture of suffering as a whole in the Army. They guided me, and they were able to guide me through the outside and the inside, and they enabled me to conduct this anthropological study. So once I was able to identify these various units, and there were 2 that I was involved in, this was the volunteer army, and I was there for 18 months. I spent a year and a half in the French infantry combat unit. And so once again, to echo Marguerite, and like her, I was the only woman over the 130 soldiers who were there. And I had semi-directed interviews. I spent every day with them, and I was able to take pictures. And eventually, I negotiated a spot for myself. I was able to take on an insider position, and for about 6 months, but they allowed me to spend time with them, to train with them, to prepare, and to do deployment in Africa. We also traveled to the site and come back, and I was involved in the missions, of course, and we took part in various actions. There were also internships in dangerous and natural environments. We also conducted anti-terrorist missions, and we did one recently. So they accepted me to the extent that I slept with them in the dormitory. There were 40 men and myself without any problems. And of course, you can ask me questions. But when we arrived, there might not have been, there was not a research framework available. So I was wondering, there were no prerequisites when I put together research teams. So it was thanks to the actors that I was able to conduct the research. These actors also experienced some impacts. It's a different way of seeing things. And I realized that my perception was very different from theirs because this required adjustments so that I could work in the field. It meant also that they had to adjust, but based on a completely different reality. And I've identified 3 types of reality. They're very important. That's why I wanted to put them here, and I wanted us to think about these. First of all, we have to look at the various funding arrangements and also French citizenship, which is an administrative prerequisite. And I thought, well, of course, there could be a spy risk, etc. There could be espionage as a risk. But when I was listening to the soldiers, French citizenship is not just citizenship, but it's also recognizing previous generations in my family who no doubt also picked up weapons and joined the army. And there was a bit of a difference between myself, the anthropologist, and the military system. So there's a notion that says that there is something we might be able to share. We might have been able to work on a basis that was established by our family members, our grandparents, and I have a certain foundation. But it's also the notion that we're close enough through our education, we're quite close to have an opportunity to communicate in the same way and to see the world in the same way. And after all, we're not so far away. And there's a certain certainty there that is, they can do this if you give them the means to do it. So I wondered about their health state, and to climb the ranks in the military, you have to be in good health, you have to take tests, and you must not suffer from chronic diseases. You have to be able to do a great deal. That's a major load. And the first question I asked was, yes, if I had a major disability, it would be difficult for me to accompany them, to carry a 40-pound bag, etc. But I was listening to them, and it's not a matter of discrimination. Rather, it's a means for them, or as they explained it, to protect everybody. Because it's, let's say, I were diabetic and the army agreed to my being there, it has to be able to provide me with the means to be with them all the while being diabetic. And this obviously involves difficult trips, let's say to Africa, as a researcher. And for every soldier that commits, that is a major. And logistics means that you travel in a helicopter with a team, and some would require medications. And the more constraints there are to allow you to stay alive, and the more you travel, the greater the risks are, because a helicopter can fall and everybody can die. So the way that they work, if, let's say, I accept people with chronic illnesses, I have the duty to keep them alive. And this might cost the lives of other soldiers. And for a diabetic man who needs this treatment, this means that you need 2, 3 other logistic steps, which might risk the lives of the other people on the team. And that is why the army refuses this, because it believes that the men who are there to help each other, to stay alive as a group. They wouldn't risk the life of a man beyond his capacities. Therefore, it requires an entire structure behind it, and that's not possible. So it requires more food or better quality food, etc. So that is a choice. And what they explained to me was what the medical doctors were explaining to the military doctors is those were the facts. But they said that regardless of, let's say, if you're a woman, you're pregnant, and by joining them in the field, I would not be able to access care I might need, to medications, but I would also be deprived of care if I'm in the desert, etc. So the doctors would not be able to deliver that care to me, and that would be undermining care. And if I had remained as a civilian, had I been excluded from the army, I would have accessed this care. So the idea is never to reduce access to care. In France, that is a very major basis. So that caused me to reflect on this. And I thought perhaps the health state is something I've seen in my own view and the French citizenship, but I also looked at communication. I wondered on my own view and my own prejudice, because I thought that certainly this is not at all very practical to go in camp. And this uniform and rank only issue for them is that everything that is not military has to be verified, because perhaps a civilian is in a sentinel mission. It might also be somebody who could be dangerous, and you will have to be recognized as somebody who does not present any risks. That is also important symbolically. And so finally, that is part and parcel of the Army's reality. They do not take the risk of interacting with us. In terms of the rank, I wondered for a long time if that's a means of protecting me because I'm a woman or civilian. Is that a means of recognizing my university status? Or is it a means of recognizing a travel in an environment? Because if you're a certain rank, you cannot communicate. And it also defies, so the lesser rank to say hello to a higher ranked officer. And it's all about respecting the hierarchy. Beyond that, however, it's a means of recognizing somebody that's saying, I am communicating with you in my means, even though I cannot communicate with you otherwise. And without rank means you're somewhat lost, and then you don't know whether or not you can ask people questions or turn to them. And the rank is the position, after all, of the researcher's position, but it's a means of breaking the ice initially. That is something they require to know whether or not they can say hello to me and speak to me. And it took me a long time to understand this because, after all, a military soldier will look at that for the first thing, and you'll look at the stars and stripes on somebody's uniform to see what rank they are. So they always wear the sign. I have a minute left. I do understand. Yes. So they have their name tag, and I'm sorry I've extended my time. And it's a reference. If you don't have a name, they don't know how to refer to you. So we can see the consequences here. And that's something that should give us thought, because more than adopting to the field to do military social science, we're asking them to think about the framework we're in. How do we build our own identity? But all of these factors, in fact, had a double identity, a double logic, a double reality underlying them. For soldiers, enabled them not to build the way that they interact, but the way that they exist. As a result, they were able to catch up with me and to adapt me to their world. Up until that point, all I could do was adapt to the constraints before me. And I think my immersion was much easier than for others, as described in the literature, because I've described this framework. So they've had the opportunity to catch up to me and to limit me as would have been necessary, although I could not do this. And that's really what I was trying to discuss today. It's wanted to present to, can you go to the ground? Can you leave behind your constraints? Can we adapt to them? And whether or not that's possible. Thank you very much.
And we'll now continue with Elizabeth.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you, Leah, and everyone for your presentations. I think it's interesting because like all our work kind of flows together nicely. So I'm excited to learn about everyone's work, and it'll be interesting to see how my work fits in with everyone else's as well. Okay. Policy changes are often a first step in organizational culture change. These changes, however, must be based on scientific evidence. How we define terms such as culture and participation fundamentally impact the trajectory of our lines of inquiry and the types of knowledge that are collected. Hachi et al. Explains that it's not possible to fully understand culture without considering issues of class, power, authority, gender, race, ethnicity, etc. Given the intersectional complexity of culture, a crucial component of the Canadian Armed Forces, or CAF's, culture change will be a paradigmatic shift towards more participatory approaches in the research it conducts with the Department of National Defense, or D&D. Participatory action research, or PAR, is a well-established methodology that enables researchers to implement this definition of culture in their practice, while foregrounding the knowledge and experiences of CAF personnel and their families. Military personnel have unique insight into the subtle cultural nuances that punctuate the professional, elemental, and ranked-based communities to which they belong. The lived experiences of veterans and members of military families can also reveal which community needs must be addressed in order for culture change to be enacted in the personal spheres of military life. PAR presents opportunities for individuals and communities to be meaningfully engaged in lived experience research. We need to explore the prevalence, scope, and types of PAR that have occurred in a military context. All action research, including PAR, follows an ongoing spiral of steps comprised of planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. PAR is an approach to research and engagement and emphasizes the building and maintenance of productive research relationships. The central concept of participation in PAR stems from Freire's philosophy that empowerment emerges through the educative potential of experiential knowledge. That is, PAR recognizes that people are experts in their own life experience and have agency to make impactful change. Since we're often positioned as community outsiders, participant perspectives provide valuable insight into the cultural nuances, relationships of power, and social structures that punctuate the context of their lives. Emancipatory action in PAR enables people to achieve a deepening awareness of both the sociocultural reality which shapes their lives and their capacity to transform it. Action in PAR is highly dependent on the context, scope, and breadth of the project, as well as the specific needs of participants and community stakeholders. Accordingly, the purposes and context of a particular study will determine the kinds of empowerment that result from the actions generated through PAR. We formulated the following research questions. What PAR has taken place within a military context? What kinds of issues are addressed by PAR? Who is doing the research? Where and why is the research taking place? Based on this lit review, we also wanted to know if PAR was feasible for D&D CAF. Is D&D CAF suited for conducting PAR? Is PAR appropriate for addressing issues pertaining to culture change in D&D CAF? And what are some of the challenges and obstacles to doing PAR in a military context? Our search was restricted to peer-reviewed studies from Five Eyes nations and NATO members. This is because they share similar objectives in diversifying their armed forces while addressing issues related to culture change. The figure shown illustrates the process and outcomes of our search strategy. Overall, a total of 30 articles were included in this lit review. This lit review also includes an analysis of whether gender and intersecting factors of identity played a salient role across the included studies. GBA Plus is an analytical process that involves the assessment of systematic inequalities in research and policymaking. An intersectional approach is used to understand how people's identities interact with sociocultural phenomena to create the circumstances of their lives. Intersectionality is important to culture change because identity forms the basic unit by which people collaborate to build culture. The socially constructed nature of identity entails that we should also be mindful of how gaps in the literature may resonate with larger social and cultural issues present in both the CAF and wider society. Military and paramilitary organizations used three main approaches when implementing PAR in their research agendas. First, the principles of PAR were used to guide the formation and maintenance of long-term research partnerships between academics and community organizations. In these cases, community leaders acted as key stakeholders who participated in determining the topics, types, and scopes of each research study within this partnership. The degree of participant involvement varied depending on the type of research, study design, and problem being addressed. Next, a PAR methodology was applied to the research process itself. In these cases, the study participants themselves were involved by varying degrees in the scope, design, implementation, analysis, and dissemination of the research. These studies took place within either short-term or long-term partnerships between academics, community leaders, organizations, and individuals. Many researchers used both approaches to the PAR in their studies. Their approach to PAR was ultimately based on the needs of the community as well as the specific context, purposes, and stages of the research relationships. The articles in this lit review addressed a variety of issues pertaining to military personnel, their families, and veterans. Veterans were the most commonly engaged category of participants, followed by student service members and military families. While these categories of participant are affiliated with military organizations, particularly the Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA in the US, they largely exist beyond the scope of military organizational hierarchy. An interesting result is the relative lack of PAR studies involving active military personnel. The most prominent military organization in this lit review was the VA, particularly in the form of a VA medical center or program. The VA has explicitly committed to using a PAR approach when conducting research within its various healthcare organizations. A notable example is a decades-long partnership in Milwaukee formed between the VA, academic researchers, and a community-based veteran-led nonprofit called Dry Hooch of America, Incorporated. Most studies in this lit review took place in the United States, with an exceptional study from Canada and another from Australia. Information on gender was mostly collected for demographic purposes and not differentiated from sex. This lack of in-depth discourse into the intersectionality of lived experiences in military organizations points to a notable gap in the PAR literature. Including the concept of intersectionality in the design of a study can generate valuable data on the sociocultural realities of members of military organizations. For example, stigma remains a strong deterrent to the use of mental health services, especially amongst veterans who are part of combat units. The stigmatization of particular traumas, such as those related to sexual misconduct, exemplify how the discouragement of help seeking may resonate with wider issues of gender within military organizations. In addition to semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and surveys, a significant number of studies included the use of innovative research methods at different phases of the process. This included the use of arts-based research methods such as photo voice, theater-based research, and narrative writing. The studies in this review also employed innovative methods of triangulating data. This included the use of participant dyads during interviews, ongoing consultations with community advisory boards, the collection of visual artifacts, and drive-along observations with police officers during mental health calls. Participation is necessary for PAR, regardless of whether a study is minimally participative or fully egalitarian. All the studies in this review fall somewhere between these opposing extremes on the spectrum of participation. As previously mentioned, approaches to PAR varied between studies in this lit review. Given the centrality of participation to PAR to the method, given the centrality of participation to PAR methodology, these variations also influence the degree of participation involved in each study. Accountability and trustworthiness were based on the degree of participant and community involvement. These factors were also dependent on the type of validity that a specific research team emphasized in their writing and study design. Transactional validity pertains to the methodological rigor of a PAR study. It assumes that the credibility of research can be increased by following particular methods, techniques, and strategies to ensure that the data and interpretation accurately reflects reality. In PAR, reality consists of both individuals' lived experiences and circumstances that occur externally to a person. Methods such as member checking, taking field notes, and verifying findings with key informants are usually employed to ensure that research is credible, accurate, trustworthy, and transferable. Most articles mention the use of some form of transactional validity in their study's design. Yet the epistemological and ontological congruence of these methods with the PAR methodology weren't always explained. PAR also requires that researchers consider how the interpretation of data can create meaningful change. Transformational validity refers to the ethical rigor of qualitative research and examines the degree to which a study raises consciousness, provokes meaningful action, and disrupts the political status quo. The research endeavor alone should be an emancipatory process. Findings were heterogeneous across studies and dependent on the sociocultural and geographical context of the research. The actionable outcomes generated within the PAR cycle itself were also included in these findings. Action in PAR may be impactful at the level of the participating individuals, communities, and organizations. It can be manifested in both the process and outcomes of a particular PAR cycle. For example, data collection methods can simultaneously build organizational capacity in a study's design. Actioning can also take the form of an initiative, project, set of commitments, or functional model that is generated from a study's findings. Real risks of harm result when the language and methods of power are co-opted to serve the interests of those who hold dominant positions of power. Feelings of betrayal, disillusionment with the credibility of the research process, and reluctance of communities to participate in future research are all possible outcomes when power is appropriated or done poorly. These harms are particularly salient for minority groups, and they can become further marginalized through institutionalized silence. Power imbalances can also be reinforced, and re-traumatization can occur through the inappropriate use of stories of lived experience. We need to be transparent about the pragmatic realities of conducting PAR within particular organizations. Compassionate action in PAR means acknowledging that some forms of change might not always be possible within a particular PAR cycle. Pushing for action that's not possible due to uncontrollable social, cultural, or political circumstances can be disempowering. Participant voices may be quieted or silenced if there's a significant risk of harm in identifying the necessary actions for change. This can take the form of social ostracization, loss of employment, political oppression, and trauma if sufficient supports for participants are not in place from the onset of a study. Therefore, we need to be mindful to prioritize participant safety in all phases of the PAR cycle. The findings of this lit review reveal a number of insights into the feasibility of PAR for D&D CAF. The need to sustain ongoing research relationships in PAR makes D&D uniquely positioned to conduct this type of research with the CAF. The close proximity and interdependence of the two organizations make the commitments of PAR possible. The pragmatic nature of research conducted by D&D CAF is also aligned with PAR's emphasis on translating research findings into actionable outcomes. The results of this lit review consolidate the appropriateness of PAR in addressing issues of personnel well-being. These issues are key in the CAF's long-term plans for reconstitution. However, there remains a need to include an intersectional lens in PAR in order to also address systemic issues of organizational culture change. Given the complex and sensitive nature of issues such as sexual misconduct and discrimination, trauma-informed approaches to research and engagement are necessary to ensure that PAR would be conducted in an ethical manner within the CAF. Life circumstances of, sorry, it's 30 more seconds. Life circumstances of participants, fiscal and cultural pushback from organizations, and limitations of resources can also alter the extent to which the methodological purity of PAR is enacted in a given context. For a study to be classified as PAR, the purposes and actions of the research study have to be formed in collaboration with participants and their communities. While the results of this lit review reveal that PAR is feasible with the context of military organizations, future research is required to determine if PAR is feasible within the specific context and capacities of D&D CAF. And yeah, that's it. Sorry. Okay. So to exit this, do I just keep going?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amber Spijkers. I'm a PhD student working on participatory action research with a group of insider and outsider researchers. And the main aim of this research project is to strengthen the psychological safety of employees within the Netherlands Armed Forces. But today I will focus on a specific group of employees, namely women, and I will show you how we use this research method to strengthen the position of women in the organization. So I think it will be a nice addition to Elizabeth's presentation. So as you probably all know, women who work in military organizations experience quite some psychologically unsafe situations, such as discrimination, harassment, bullying, and unwanted sexual attention. And because they are a minority working in in military organizations, they also have to conform to this masculine culture that is present in these organizations. And in the Netherlands Armed Forces, well, the Netherlands Armed Forces have been trying to improve the situation for women, but they have mainly been doing this by the diversifying the armed forces, for example, by increasing the influx, retention, and promotion of women in the organization. This has been going on over the last decade, but it has been shown that this is only moderately effective, and it's also subject to internal and external criticism. So because policy doesn't target the social integration of women or cultural changes, this has been identified as a policy gap, which I think has also already been mentioned this morning. So this raises the question, how can we actively strengthen the position of women in the armed forces? And our research group started doing participatory action research in the Netherlands Armed Forces. And we think this method might be able to bridge this policy gap. And we think this might be the case because employees are seen as experts in their own working place or work environment. And that makes that they know what's at stake and they know what types of interventions might be effective or most effective. Employees are also seen as co-owners of the research and collaborate with researchers by understanding and improving practices and by developing interventions that are in line with employees' needs. And PAR also stimulates speak up behavior, empowerment, and normative thinking of employees. And we think this might make the organization more susceptible to a cultural change. So I'll show you the setup of our study real quickly. So 10 locations participated on a voluntarily in the research project, and we call these testing grounds. So we included 1 policy body, 7 operational units, and 2 educational institutes. And within each testing ground, an insider and outsider researcher worked together with the employees, a diverse group of employees from different ranks in one testing ground. And as already mentioned, we go through in PAR, we go through different cycles of research. And at first we started out with exploration within each testing ground, and we performed individual and focus group interviews and thematically analyzed these. And on basis of the result of this analysis, we moved to an action phase in which we, as researchers, work together with employees in working groups, and we developed and implemented interventions. And simultaneously, we also evaluated these interventions, but also the working groups itself. So how does it feel to work together in this way? And I will give you some insight in our results, or I'll show you some of our results. First, I will delve into some insights from the exploration phase by showing you what the employees' experiences and needs were regarding policies and interventions, focusing on female employees. And second, I will show you some of the lessons that we learned from improving the position of women in practice. So what we noticed was that women's negative experiences often remain invisible because women find it very difficult to openly share their experiences because they fear or that there will be repercussions for themselves or for those involved. For example, one employee told us, imagine that you would grab my ass while going out. That wouldn't sit right with me, but I would not report you because I wouldn't want you to suffer any negative consequences. And during these interviews, the male colleagues were also present, and they shared that they were often unaware of these negative consequences, but they also found it eye-opening to hear about these, and they responded really supportively towards their female colleagues. Another thing that we noticed was that women's behavior is put under the microscope to a great extent, while women have no need for this unsolicited attention, or they also don't want a special status within the military. They would rather be seen as soldiers than as military women. For example, one employee told us, someone told me that I just had to accept that I am a role model. That thought is not appealing to me. Why do I have to be a role model? I don't want to be one. And one example of a specific intervention that was already at place or has been at place for many years is that at the start of military education program, for example, for cadets who just entered the organization, there is a talk for women organized, and they are giving practical tips, but also are given a warning that they have to be aware that if they get overly friendly with male colleagues, you'll be known as slut or a mattress during the rest of your career. And one respondent told us, what I think is offensive is that it's called a talk for women. Why aren't men addressed in a similar fashion? Like, hey guys, this ain't no paradise. Why is this considered a women's issue? Furthermore, or lastly, we encountered a counterproductive code of conduct culture within the organization, which entailed that if incidents happened, the organization responded with instating more rules to protect women against transgressive or sexually transgressive behavior. But this often worked or produced counterproductive results because it put women in the spotlight even more, singled them out, and diminished spontaneous contact with colleagues. And someone told us, people are already watching you because you are the odd one out. And then people become even more careful how they approach you or what they say to you. And it makes that you are put under the microscope to an even greater extent. So, and both male and female colleagues shared with us that they are really tired of this code of conduct culture, and that they rather prefer to have a dialogue about what is normal and desirable behavior and conduct. So now we move, this is the knowledge that we gained during the exploration. Now we move to the action and evaluation phase of the study. And I will show you some of the lessons that we learned from actually working in the practice, trying to change the work environment. And I will share with you 4 preconditions that we identified that were needed to develop interventions in working groups to improve the position of women. Well, first of all, it is required to have some awareness and acknowledgement of the negative experiences and position of women. However, sometimes this was quite difficult because there's a fear of bad publicity. People are really proud of their organization, of their work, and there's also an unease with the sudden independence that they experience as participants in PAR research. And this can all stand in the way of awareness and acknowledgement. But we also noticed that if you keep putting this topic on the agenda, people become, they open up and they become more at ease to discuss this topic eventually. A second precondition is that you have to create a safe space for dialogue and joint ownership. And this might be easier said than done, of course. But we noticed that it helps to temporarily move away from hierarchy. For example, by calling each other by the first name basis. Let's see, first name basis. And also giving the floor to all employees that are present in a working group. So also the more quiet colleagues. And to give an example of an intervention or an action that was created in one of the working groups. This was a working group that consisted of cadets, but also educators and social workers, for example. They thought this talk for women, this warning that is given, has to change. And we need to move away from underlying the differences between men and women. And they created a norm awareness dialogue in which cadets, or it's a facilitated dialogue in which cadets discuss their assumptions, prejudices, and they discuss how they value each other. So it's really about the norms that one places upon another. A third precondition is that in order to create or bottom-up interventions, you also need top-down trust, support, and mandate, at least in a military organization that we work in. But we also saw that the management is not used to these bottom-up interventions. It's a completely different way of working in the organization, and they might also need some time to get used to this. So time is key, I would say. And the fourth precondition is we need structural implementation of interventions. So cultural changes seem to be reliant on structural changes in the Netherlands Armed Forces, at least. This is due to a job rotation system that makes that employees change position every 2 to 3 years. So you really need to establish an intervention because people who develop it will move away to a different location. So I hope this has given you some insight into how it actually what it's done in practice. I have some take-home messages and discussion points to share with you. So first of all, temporarily moving away from hierarchy stimulates dialogue, joint ownership, collaboration, and helps to create a safe space. Developing bottom-up interventions in a hierarchical organization always requires top-down trust and support, or maybe this is specific for military organizations. And it can be, maybe this also conflicts with the bottom-up principles of PAR research itself. That might be a nice discussion point. We notice that the initiation of cultural change requires simultaneous structural change. And we can conclude that PAR focuses on inclusion rather on diversification of the armed forces. A preliminary conclusion would be that it seems to be a valuable addition, at least, to top-down policies that are at stake. But whether it will actually be able to bridge this policy gap is something that only time will tell. Thank you for listening.
So thank you for these 4 presentations, and I love them. I mean, because it was a surprise that it was about gender integration, but using this specific manner, and I love all about gender integration personally, but so this peculiar methodological approach, which is, and I'm jealous from the field work of Leah and Marguerite, and the work you've done. So I have question. I already have one virtual one that I will ask you, and then we will see if there's other question here, but if there's not, I have question. But so we have a question from Joel Watson, which is asking, I think, all panelists, what methodological steps are required in PAR to determine what the alleged baseline control or culturally dominant cohort is? Here, what are the defining cultural characteristics prior to testing experiences, perception of other against same? So really methodological. I think you need to, yeah.
Hello, okay. Thank you for your question, Joelle.
Yes.
So I just want to recap to make sure I'm understanding. So you want to know within, thank you, within PAR methodology. Yes, it really depends on the scope of the project and who you're working with in terms of community and participants. So because this methodology requires more of a collaboration and seeing participants and communities as stakeholders, they will have an understanding of like what their experiences are within the culturally dominant cohort. Oftentimes this type of work is done with people who are part of employment equity groups or minority groups. But in terms of baseline and control, a lot of the work done with PAR is qualitative in nature. So we don't use terms such as baseline and control. It's more of an iterative process, kind of like the anthropological work that Margaret was talking about, where you don't really come with a preconceived notion or hypothesis when you come into the research. When you come into PAR as a researcher, you are really coming with more of like a blank slate or tabula rasa perspective, and you let the participants, identify what are the issues that are pressing in the community, well, in their particular community. What are the issues between, subcultures and the dominant culture in which they work in? And part of what doing PAR research requires, and I think Amber, you touched upon this, and so did Leo, is really spending time with the people you're doing research with, getting a real feel for what their lived experiences are, what it's like being in the field with them when they're going on training or working. So not only are you getting people's, lived experiences as they tell you in interviews, but you're also there alongside them, observing what their workplace is like, seeing what it's like to go on a ship and have really confined spaces, like going to the training field and being like, okay, like I notice that there's very few women. You don't have to tell me that, I can see that. So a lot of it is really being part of the research, having the researcher really be part of the experience as well, if that makes sense. Yes, sorry.
And sometimes, it's funny how the participants are also surprised that we don't have an hypothetical deductive approach, which we have things to test, and we're like, no, we want to discover from you. So it's always funny to have this kind of reaction. But is there any question from the attendee? Nothing. Yes, Marshall?
I have one. It's for...
there's...
Yeah, I have one. It's for Amber to start, but then I'd be really curious about the French perspective as well. So you use the terms employees and management when you were describing the members of the Netherlands Defense Force. And I'm wondering, is that how the soldiers, sailors, aviators view themselves? Whereas in like a Canadian context, we speak to members of the force, and I'm just wondering how they relate themselves to the overall institution. Is it just a job, or is it more than that?
Well, no, it's. I think I use these terms to just for the presentation, but it's a big part of their identity to work in the armed forces, and I think that's also that makes it sometimes hard to be critical for them to be, critical of the organization itself. So that's a big challenge, I think, also doing a PAR in military organizations. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
And maybe we can ask, because I think it was a topic of Margaret about how the oldest generation were critical of the young who didn't have this full military identity, maybe?
Oui, alors, je suis pas exactement sûre de savoir comment répondre à cette question.
I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I don't think it can be termed as just a conflict between generations, because there's always been criticism between the old and the new. And but they're part of the members of the older generation that are completely open to changes and aware of the difficulties. And so there is a change. And so this idea that there's a conflict between the old and the new is a bit contrived. That would be my best answer.
And I mean, I have some question, but we already technically to the break time. So I will, because it was so interesting. And thank you so much for the 4 presentations. Merci beaucoup. Et les questions, je vais les garder pour demain parce que je pense que ça pourrait être...
And I'm going to keep my questions for tomorrow because I think it would be a good segue.
Promises and difficulty of using participatory research and how we need to be careful as researchers about the pitfall, because we have the some kind of responsibility when it comes to the participants. And also it's not easy to access the field work and especially because it was a surprise, but as woman researcher, researching woman, military woman, there's a lot of dimension, but it will be for tomorrow. And let's go to have a coffee break right now. And we will meet again in 15 minutes, but thank you again for the first panel.